My name is John Marjolis. I'm the Global Solutions Alliances Architect for Nutanix. I work with our alliance partners such as Zerto. I also have a background in BCDR, which kind of helps when I'm giving these things. So, as I said before, if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out, please feel free to talk. You don't have to save them until the end. There's a small enough group in here where we're not gonna, I don't think we'll interrupt the flow of the presentation too much, okay? So, what we'll talk about first is some basic information about Nutanix. How many of you are familiar with Nutanix? Good. I used to walk into a room 3 years ago and nobody, they Nutanix. It was extremely common. So Nutanix, the idea behind Nutanix is very simple. Our founder was chief scientist of the Google file system. Any quick question, anybody know how many servers one Google admin can manage? Anybody take a guess?
1,024.
How much?
1,024.
No. The actual answer is 20,000 per one admin. So our founder looked at that and said, okay, why can't we bring that to the mainstream or to the enterprise? So what we've done with Nutanix is we've taken all that stuff on the right-hand side, or excuse me, left-hand side, server, storage controller, all that, and we've combined it down into a single platform that's consolidated. The idea is to bring the disk closer to the CPU. And on top of that, cluster those all via software to be able to leverage everything inside of all those boxes to service the I/O and to service the application. And the reason this is titled Think About the Applications is because we have a different paradigm. We are not storage controllers. We're not going to come in and say, I can get you 300,000 IOPS, I can get you 400,000 IOPS, right? I'm not going to get in that discussion with you. What I'm going to get in the discussion with you about is how your app functions, what you want the app to do, what's your performance currently, what are you looking to get out of it, is it important to you, right? I mean, that's a question people don't really ask themselves quite often. You'd be surprised. And that's part of the reason Zerto exists, right? is because a lot of people actually don't know how important apps are until they're gone. How many of you have done a business impact analysis on your applications? Anybody? Good idea. Figure out how much your app costs. And that's going to play a big part in what we're talking about today. All right. I'm going to keep the Nutanix stuff to 2 slides, and after that, we're going to get pretty much into the BCDR stuff. Excuse me, DR. So after you get that initial cluster, you need what we call 3 nodes. 3 nodes or 3 CPU. They're clustered over top of a rack switch. They share no backplane other than that switch connection. As you expand, you can add a single node each time. So what does this mean for you? You don't have to spend $1 bazillion and hope that you got the math right on the storage that you have, which, as a storage admin in the past, was a big problem because it's very hard to talk to your boss and say, hey, you know what, I need to spend millions of dollars on something and I actually don't know if it's going to last us 3 years. I think it will. So how many have had that conversation? A lot of fun, right? And then you have to explain, okay, how and then when it goes up chain, they ask them, okay, why is IT a sinkhole? And you can't really answer that question, right? So we've shifted that paradigm. We've taken it and looked at the apps. Even to the point when we're, as Nutanix people, when we're going out and talking to people and selling, we're not talking to the storage admin generally. We're talking to the application owner, we're talking to the architect, we're talking to the business owner. And what we've done is very simply brought the focus back on the apps, and the back-end infrastructure should be invisible. There should be no reason for you to touch it. Unless you want to look at it, you can show them the bright flashing lights. It looks really cool with the lights off in the data center. But that should be your interaction with it. Even when you upgrade, everything should be single click, non-disruptive, just like you'd expect in the cloud. When Amazon goes down, it's a huge story, right? It doesn't happen often. When Google, has anyone had a Google instance where Google went down on them? No. We want to bring that same goodness to your apps. How we do that is on each one of those servers or nodes. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is there, and this may be further in your slides, is there a solution that you've come up with to separate if you need just more storage or just more compute to your Nutanix cluster?
Yeah, it's actually not in the presentation, but yeah, you still buy a little bit of compute, but that's only because you're getting the actual goodness of the file system as well, but it's more storage heavy and it doesn't actually participate in virtualization. Okay, but it is 60 terabytes in 2U. It should be 200 terabytes in 2U by next year. So how we accomplish this? CVM. The CVM is what's called a controller virtual machine. It sits on every node, and it's your storage controller. So every time you send a request in that node, it's going to go to the CVM over the bus. So you have direct access to a storage controller. Now, with traditional storage, generally you're going to run out of bandwidth on the controller at some point. You're going to have to add another controller. You're going to have to add more disk, or whatever the case may be. There's generally a balance you're looking for that you never hit perfectly. Every time you scale out, everything is linear with our solution. So everything, when we have case studies where it's 0 to 3,000 machines with 0 degradation in performance in the exact same predictable operation. And the fun part about this too is that after 3 years, our equipment actually performs better than it does in the first year. How do we do this magic? There's no sacrificing, no goats getting killed or anything like that, any of that weird stuff, right? We save that for the weekends. But what we do is all the upgrades are in the software. If it's a tweak on how we handle the metadata, if we find it out, we put it in the software, guess what? Everything gets faster, right? And when you upgrade, again, 0 disruption. One node goes down, upgrades, comes back up, goes on to the next node, your VMs are motioning around, your end users don't even use it. As a matter of fact, at the customer I'm going to talk about, Lippert, I was actually the salesperson back when I was in the sales on this particular account, and I asked them to do it during production, just to prove a point. Nobody noticed. Upgrades in the software, upgrades in the firmware were done during production. So the CVM sits on each node, and the CVM actually provides something called data locality. What happens is when you write data on that node, it's going to try and keep the data local to where the request is coming from. So if that VM is sitting on node A, it's going to try and keep the data on node A. It's also going to make copies and disperse it throughout the cluster for redundancy. So if something then goes down or motions, it has data in the other spot, and it just motions what it's missing over to that node. And on top of it all the data that's hot can always stay in the SSD tier, so it's always going to be the fastest tier of storage. Everything performs fast all the time. We can also provide things like compression, erasure coding, deduplication, storage resilience, all that stuff. One of the things I like to tell is between our 3.4 and 3.5, we introduced 75 features. Customers got them. That included deduplication, compression. Your machines are ready to upgrade. Nothing extra to pay for it. So as we find features, we also introduce them too, to our clients. So, any questions on any of that? That's pretty much where the Nutanix stuff ends. I'm going to start talking more general about BCDR and how applications and things like that. So we're going to talk about the state of data protection and disaster recovery, Nutanix data protection and disaster recovery, and of course, positioning guidelines and use cases. No, that is wrong. Somebody got the wrong slide in there. We're going to talk about how Zerto integrates with us. So these stats are pretty common. Data loss is up 400% since 2012. Okay? How many of you have experienced data loss? How bad is it? How bad of an impact was it? All right? Especially if you're in a compliance-related industry, especially if you're in a healthcare-related industry or something where you need that data. If it's a very important application and you lose that data, it's a very bad thing. Data loss downtime costs enterprise $1.7 trillion. That is not an exaggeration. It's very common. One of the reasons I asked about BIA or business impact analysis before is that most companies don't do that. And what happens is they've got these either completely overblown data protection schemes or completely underutilized data protection schemes, right? These things that just don't work, are not fit for that specific application. So in other words, you've got one application which may be housing, pictures of grandma's trip to Fire Island or whatever the case may be, right, on one app. And then you've got another app that's running the entire business. You've either got the same data protection scheme, or this one is not protected enough, and this one is overprotected. It's very common. Okay? It's very common. What you got to do is look and put dollars to it. It's very easy to convince your CEO or CIO or whatever the case may be. If you can put dollars to how much the application will cost you if it's gone, it's very easy to make that case. It no longer becomes an insurance policy where you're trying to say, okay, well, this could go bad and it might be bad for us. No, if this goes bad, this is how much it costs you. So highly recommend it if you do it. 71% of organizations not confident in disaster recovery. What I found as a DR consultant, and some of the companies I worked with were General Motors, JP Morgan Chase, some pretty large companies, right? What I found in even large and small companies is that most people like to do DR desktop tests, okay, when they had their DR, and most people failed them. And this is very common when you have a legacy application, when you've got an old backup application. You may have something even on, something floating around on DLT, the tape drive you're keeping around because you've got compliance needs or whatever the case may be. But even the DR case, if you fail that, it's a bad thing, and it's very hard to actually go back and figure out where the root cause is, right? So when you're talking DR, and something like Zerto comes in very handy in that case, right? The best thing you can do with the DR test is do not do tabletop exercises. I'm going to say this again. Do not do tabletop exercises. Never do tabletop exercises. Okay? Do the actual DR, function and fail over, run in that environment when you're doing it. Don't just give it a 2-minute setup and say, okay, go. Run it for a little while. You don't want to find out when something bad is happening that you're only protected for a short period of time. Okay. And companies with multiple vendors lost 3 times as much data. Very common. I can tell you a little story about one of the clients I had. They were a very large printing and publishing company, and a vendor, who shall remain nameless, came in, plugged in a disk in their array, and blew away. Mind you, by the way, this is in 2000. Okay, so this is going to sound like paltry amount of data now, right? They blew away 11 terabytes at 5 sites. They blew away 55 terabytes back in 2000. You know what their recovery strategy? This was during production. Okay, this is their production season. You know what their recovery strategy was? They had incrementals forever with DLT3 at 5 different plants. That little, quote unquote, little mistake, that technology at that point was even past its prime, right? But that cost them millions and millions of dollars in downtime. So it's easier for you to get used to a technology, to test a technology in something like a Zerto, right? Or in concert with some of the other features that are available in Nutanix as well, to be able to tier your recovery to the importance of your data, and also test it and ensure that something like that doesn't happen to you. TCO is very expensive. As I talked a little bit before, going in and talking to somebody who doesn't understand the importance of your data or how much money it costs you when you're talking to a C-level, and you're trying to tell them, oh, this does this neat feature where I can fence I/O and I can do this and I can do that, and you just watch their eyes glaze over. Has anybody ever had that? They just don't. They don't understand it. All right. When you start talking about things like multiple vendors and TCO and money and things like that, and what really lights those guys' fires, guys or gals, pardon me, it's easy to talk to them about it. Most backup is not virtualization ready. There are some old backups, and I don't know if you know, but for instance, I'll give you an example. I used to work at a very large backup company. It's easy to find the code is very old. It wasn't written for virtualization. Okay? Anybody here ever use I have to mention the name, but if anybody ever been in an environment to use Veritas? Okay. You know what BP stands for? Backup Pro. A name that hasn't been used since 1997. They were not written for virtualization. versus newer technologies, again, like a Zerto, right, that were written for virtualization. That's one of the things that's really great about both of our technologies, and we have this symbiotic relationship where we're both written for virtualization, right, as well as physical. Zerto can do physical as well, but we're both written for virtualization. We understand it. Recovery is much easier. Give you different options, many different options. And also data center silos. This is another fun topic. How many people have, let's say, different solutions in different data centers for different things? Maybe different arrays, maybe different storage. Okay, yeah, exactly. So what you wind up with is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, one guy who's been working there for like 30 years who knows a specific application that you're trying, that you can't figure out how to get rid of, or this application, it's a draw on you, money-wise. The recovery process is different from one site to another. So in a DR, you've got one situation that's completely different. And how many people actually have runbooks written? Okay. And most of the times, you don't have a runbook, right? So the people who have runbooks, congratulations, it's awesome. So most of the time, you don't know how to recover in a DR situation, or you're relying on one person. I'll give you another example, Hurricane Katrina, okay? So Hurricane Katrina, all these vendors that were sending their tapes to an offsite location, okay? During that failure, or during that disaster, how do you think they got their data back? They didn't. No roads, right? So, I mean, there are things you got to think of. The vast majority of disasters, right, are going to be very small. The vast majority of disasters are caused by somebody hitting a delete button or pulling a plug or whatever the case may be. That's a vast majority of it, right? Those are the most you're going to protect against. But in the big situations, when everybody thinks a smoking hole, nobody thinks of the fact, so, oh, I might not have roads. How do I get my stuff back? Right? So you've got all these silos and all these different implementations at different sites, and you got to figure out, you got to manage and juggle to figure out what you're going to get back and how you're going to get it back. So when I talk about data protection strategies, you really have to have one from front to back. Yeah, how many are compliance-related industries? Anybody? Oh, come on, it's not that bad. So anyway, if you're in a compliance-related industry, archiving is going to be very important to you. Anything after 10 to 14 days, right? It has to be stored, generally going to be in an immutable format of some sort. You got to be able to recover it for litigation or test purposes or whatever the case may be. Archiving strategy is, in a sense, disaster for compliance, if you think about it, right? But the good part about that is, from a cost standpoint, you can move your SLAs out longer. Generally, with compliance, you don't have a 2-minute or 10-minute recovery time, or RPO, right? Or RTO, right? So you can move it out longer. Design it like that. Snapshots, short-term capability, not backup. Very important. A lot of people, and I used to work for a company that would essentially pitch their solution as backup for snapshots. Snapshots are not backup. It's the most expensive way to store your data. All right? Backup, fantastic. Easily controlled RPO, RTO. Snapshot, short-term recovery. Backup, long-term recovery. For instance, how many people are keeping snapshots of their databases longer than 10 days? Good, you shouldn't. You'd be surprised how many times I run into that. And if you roll a database back 10 days, good things are not going to happen. So snapshots, generally what I try to do when I'm advising people is try to figure out the recovery point, try to figure out what's important, right? And then I'll say generally the vast majority of them I'll see will be, you'll have snapshots taken every 15 minutes to an hour or 5 minutes, or whatever the case may be, in the journals and logs, so on and so forth. And then at the end of the day, you take one full and blow everything else away underneath it, unless you need it for compliance. Right? But that's a very common setup, and I suggest it if you don't need the logs. With the full, you'll capture everything anyway, and you don't need to roll it back constantly, and you're just wasting space if you're doing it any other way. Asynchronous replication. Very good over WAN. We offer that technology, as well as Zerto. Zerto's is much better than ours, I will say that. So asynchronous replication, fantastic. Will help you in a DR. You can control your recovery points. You can also, a lot of people don't think about this, but also control the cost of your bandwidth with asynchronous replication. If you don't need synchronous replication, don't do it. You're just wasting money. Metro availability is our term for synchronous replication. I only suggest it, again, if that application has to be up consistently, all right? Now, one quick question for you as admins. How many people, or admins, or architects, or whatever the case may be, how many people ever come to you and say, this application could be gone for 24 hours and nobody would notice? I don't care if you ask the business unit. A lot of people do that, or they always come up and say, I need it away, 5 minutes, it needs to be done, I haven't need an RPO, or so on and so forth, right? It's another good way to just hit them across the face with that BIA. It's not worth that much money. Here's the proof, okay? You can save yourself, and I've walked into places, and I've saved them millions upon millions of dollars by just implementing a simple strategy like this. You guys ever, anyone here have a backup catalog? You know what that is? Basically, you put together a list of services. You define the RPOs and RTO, right? And then you say, okay, you can pick this service, you can pick this service, or you can pick this service, or you can pick this service. Very good way for cost control, make you look like a champ when the money comes in at the end of the year, and also for DR. All right. So with us, we do offer a bit of backup, but I come from more of a backup BCDR background. I prefer something like a Zerto. All right, our backup is very rudimentary at this point. It's slower. The management is integrated, and the storage services, what we're really talking about there is maintaining redundancy. So for us, even if you lose a node in a solution, you're still going to maintain redundancy because we're still writing multiple copies. And many of our competitors, even when you pull a disk out, you're only going to get RF1. It's a very common thing that they hide behind because they're using older technologies. So always make sure that whatever solution you go with has that factor as a base protection against things like bit rot, disk corruption, things like that. Always make sure that even if you lose disk, if you lose node, whatever the case may be, you at least have RF2. Now everybody know what RF2 and RF3 is? Take that as a no. I didn't see anybody shaking their heads yes. So what RF2 is when you write a block, 2 copies of that block get distributed throughout the cluster. They shouldn't be on the same node. RF3 is 3 copies. So RF3 will allow you to actually lose an entire part of a cluster, 4 nodes in our case. We rarely see RF3 implemented, but if you have something that's absolutely mission critical, definitely to go with something like that, RF3. Question?
Related to basically to Zerto when you are suggesting for tier 1 applications.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
So Zerto for tier 1 applications, you are seeing this as a model. Zerto still is an active passive application.
Yeah, I think I would say active from our standpoint. I would say active. I would say, well, even our metro is active. Even our metro is active passive.
RTO,
So.
RTO is still fine, but if it is a really mission critical application having a like real-time operating systems, that kind of scenario, then can you still suggest this model? Because Zerto, whatever, yes, I can manage the RPOs in 5 seconds within 15 minutes, but still it's an active passive model. It's not
Oh yeah, so that was the metro availability I was talking about earlier when I said metro at the end. Metro is synchronous. The one thing about that though is you have to make sure that you can implement it because in many cases synchronous replication has some pretty stringent bandwidth.
right. There is
Yeah.
challenge and everything, but that's how you are calling them as mission critical applications, right? Those has to be active.
I personally consider anything with a sub anything with a sub 10-minute RPO to be mission critical. From a cost perspective, everything for me is cost, right? I was a consultant, so I constantly had to justify my existence. So.
But if you are using Zerto, like still your metro availability functionality will be underlying used as a
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no impact on it whatsoever. Now, take that back. The only impact you have to worry about is bandwidth, right? If you've got 2 things replicating at the same time, then you have to consider the amount of data change or rate of data change, and then your bandwidth, latency, all that other fun stuff as well. Okay? Oh, by the way, actually, we'll do it later. So, when we talk about RTO, RPO, we're just getting this. You may be psychic. RTO and RPO. All right? If you're talking minutes and hours, minutes and near zero RPO, RTO, right? Minor incidents, major incidents. That's a bit misleading because in some cases, minor incidents can require a very short RPO. Right? So, from our standpoint, when we talk about it, when we talk about things like time stream, which is our synchronous or asynchronous replication, Cloud Connect, and Zerto has this feature as well, and they're a little bit more. We only do Azure and AWS, where Zerto can kind of bounce around a little bit. Cloud Connect is essentially a backup being replicated to the cloud. And then when you start getting into the smaller ones, smaller RPO, RTO, remote replication, asynchronous, and metro availability is, again, synchronous, right? This is kind of a backup services catalog. If you haven't implemented a backup services catalog, I would say it would make your life a lot easier, especially in a DR situation. Okay? Because you will know, you'll be able to tie back to that specific solution exactly what's in there. So when I was at JP Morgan Chase, for instance, okay? JP Morgan Chase, it was kind of the opposite of everything else you've probably ever worked in. They had to justify the reason that they had to be on a specific tier when they came in. There was no, we want to be on this tier, and you kept them on that tier. No, they had to come up with us and make a business case as to why they had to have a business continuance volume, why they had to be on a fiber channel, why they had to have a zero RPO, right? They had to come and justify it to us at the time. So something like a backup services catalog in your case in the BCDR would be fantastic, right? I highly recommend it. It'd make your life a hell of a lot easier. And then when it comes to disaster, in many cases, for instance, in an application, let's say, I'll give you an example. Let's say that you want to have a SQL app running, okay? You got a SQL app running, and you've got an end user needing to access that app, right? What if their VPN end client isn't correct? What happens? In many cases, they lose access to that particular app, right? Maintaining it, and then on top of that, maintaining that end client and making sure everything is okay is a huge pain. Especially when we start talking about more and more people getting in the system, right? It's very hard to do. When you start thinking about disaster recovery, okay, our stuff and Zerto stuff is fantastic for recovering the applications, and the reason we title this seminar, focus on the applications, is make sure that you're actually tiering your applications, but then also think about how you're actually going to access that data on the back end. Things like, is my network multi-homed? How am I going to change my IP addresses if I'm using a service, right? If I'm using my service, how do I change my MX records? Is anybody going to be on the back end there to help me? Now, all these things are little things you got to think about in the application that a lot of times aren't put into DR plans. So when we talk about our integration with Zerto, and Zerto at this point will function with our ESXi, but AHV, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Acropolis hypervisor. Anybody not familiar with the Acropolis hypervisor? Okay, it's coming. We'll say that. So from my standpoint, the way I look at it is Zerto fills in the holes that we have in our backup solution. We're not a backup-centric company. We weren't born to be a backup company. We provided, in my opinion, the bare minimum at some point to be able to suffice to be able to have your application service with backup and recovery. But we didn't provide short RPOs. Right now, currently, with our asynchronous, the shortest RPO we have is 1 hour. So you can see where something like Zerto can come into play, and Zerto has more integration with logs and backup and so there's applications, so on and so forth. All this stuff comes into play on the Zerto side. Zerto's also better at cloud at this point as far as backing up to cloud, more options, okay? And then on top of that, you can automate the DR process. One of the things that we can't do that Zerto does well is being able to test your DR. And how many people have actually done that and tested their DR? How often do you do that? For 6 months? How often? The cloud provider? Okay. So I would say generally 6 months is pretty good. But I would also say that if you have any big change in your environment, whether it be a change of type of server, change of type of storage, so on and so forth, do the test again. Okay, you will be surprised how many people fail that test. So we talk about shorten RTO, RPO. You guys probably could diagram this in your sleep if somebody gave you Visio. But it's very simple. Whether you're leveraging the cloud, and another thing too I want to talk about on the cloud side. You said you're a cloud vendor? Okay, earmuffs. So, no, I'm just kidding. So when you're looking to the cloud, right, the one thing about the cloud that can be very tricky is that not all things are cheaper in the cloud. Okay, a lot of people think that. It's not always the case, right? Cloud DR, though, is one of those things that can be cheaper in the cloud, consistently, right? And so what you want to do when you look at a cloud, and I'll give you an example, and I know you're not AWS, right? Okay, great. Okay, I figured, yeah. I always envision like just like crowds of people with AWS shirts on and kind of, but so one of the things that's kind of interesting when you go to a service like an Azure or an AWS, right? Azure is a good service, AWS is a good service, right? But the one thing that's interesting is you got to be very cognizant of the charges. How many people here have been burned going to the cloud with charges? Okay, all right. And not all cloud vendors are like this, but for instance, one of the big things when it first came out was Amazon Glacier. Wow, I can get storage for 0.1 of a cent? That's awesome. I'm gonna move all my stuff there. Okay? I had a client that moved their stuff to Glacier and did not realize that when you send a request to Glacier to recover your data, it's like 6 hours before it even gets to the queue to start your recovery. Read the fine print. I'm telling you, a lot of these things you'll see can be very scary and cost you a lot of money. And pulling your data back out of Amazon, one of my favorite things about Amazon is it's a very good service, don't get me wrong. Okay, it's a fantastic service, but you just have to be aware of what you're getting into. A lot of people just don't think about it and they get caught. I had a client that was expecting a $10,000 a month bill on Amazon and got a $300,000 a month bill on Amazon because they weren't putting the applications in the right tier. And this is where actually working with a good cloud vendor and a knowledgeable cloud vendor can help you out. Okay, anybody here ever used an Amazon Snowball? Yeah, it's their the Nutanix guy, but it's essentially just a portable system that you push your data to, and it gets ingested up in the cloud. You ship it back to them, and ingest up in the cloud. It's a way to seed things, right? The one thing that's kind of interesting about it is if you look at the fine print, it says cannot be used for extracting data. So that's only a one-way thing, even though they kind of make it look like a two-way thing. It's only a one-way thing. So what happens is, let's say you put 5 terabytes of data up there, and you try to pull it back, you're going to get an extraction fee pulling that data out. It's going to cost you money generally. So be very cognizant of that stuff. And in a DR situation as well, one of the things you want to worry about with a cloud vendor, and a little bit of my background again, is I helped Seagate build their cloud DR service. One of the things that we found out is networking really messes people up in DR, okay? So let's say that you've got this MPLS network somewhere, right? And you have one ingress-egress point, and that MPLS goes down during a disaster. What happens? If your MPLS, if it's not multi-homed, if you don't have multiple access points going in and out of it, so on and so forth, even things like, I'll give you an example. This is not common, but there was one DR service provider back in the 2000s that was based up in Minneapolis, and their data center was below the water line in the river. So, and it did flood eventually. But that's one of the things, just make sure you're checking out your cloud provider and make sure you're checking those things out, right? Cloud's a fantastic thing. We actually consider ourselves a cloud company. We bring cloud-like functionality. We're based on cloud technology. But just be aware of what you're getting into. Make sure you research it a little bit, especially for DR. Also very important to make sure that you are defining SLAs for DR. And tier those SLAs with the cloud provider as well, because you can save yourselves money on it too. Everybody doing that? Anybody using cloud DR? One person shaking their head? Okay. Just make sure you're tiering it because, again, you're saving money based on its cost per, it's pay to play. You want to make sure you're saving your money.
Can you elaborate on SLA for VR?
Sure. So when I was at Seagate, when we designed the recovery times, right, is we had an SLA of 2 hours, 5 hours, or 6 hours, 12 hours, and 24 hours. And you would put your app into that specific bucket, or there was also a 0.
But if we're talking about Zerto, is your SLA on the RPO or the RTO?
It's how you define. It's actually how you define it in Zerto, right? But what I'm talking about more so on SLA is availability to resources. Okay, so if you have a cloud and you've got Zerto based in the cloud, right, you've got to have that cloud provider tell you definitely this is going to be available within a 5.9, so on and so forth, and so you can define your SLA and meet it, right? And in some cases, if you're using Zerto as a service, you want to make sure that your recovery you're going to have, in case of like for instance, in case of a large disaster, you want to make sure that your data center is not going to be in the same FEMA region. It's not going to be on the same power grid as another one. There's all these little things you kind of have to worry about. So in your SLA, when you're looking at it, make sure that they're guaranteeing you in writing. Because in many cases, a lot of those providers will do that for you because most of the stuff will be covered by business insurance anyway, even disaster declaration fees and things like that, right? So they will be happy to give you an SLA on the availability of the equipment as well as, if you're using it as a service for backup and recovery, RTO, RPO. Make more sense? Okay. Also, another thing too, self-healing is very important. That's going to sound kind of funny, but how the back end of our system works is, anybody here ever uses STIG? Okay. STIG is what's called the Security Threat Implementation Guide. It's usually about that long, and what it does is it defines a spec for your system to be in. If it deviates from that spec, you're out of compliance. We actually use auto-remediating technology on the back end, so if there's an anomaly, you can activate a STIG, and if there's an anomaly in something on the CVM or something that's different in the system, it'll auto-remediate. On top of that, we also leverage things like MapReduce. If you haven't gone to the Nutanix Bible and you want some great insight into what Nutanix is, Google Nutanix Bible. Or if you're having trouble sleeping and not that interested in technology, Google Nutanix Bible. We'll talk about everything that you want to know about Nutanix. Right? And the things about self-healing that's interesting is since we are based on a web scale technology, if a disk goes bad with us, every disk participates in that rebuild in the cluster. Okay? So contrary to what you would see with an old system or an older system or London array-based system, the bigger we get, the faster rebuilds get. Complete opposite of what you're currently dealing with, probably. All right, so self-healing is very important. You want to make sure that you're constantly up and running. Redundancy of key components. You should have redundancy of networking, redundancy of compute, redundancy of storage, redundancy of redundancy. Right? You should have all of that. Okay? For a node failure resilience, what we're talking about is you should be able to lose a node in a cluster, at least a node in a cluster, and still be functional, completely functional. Your end users probably shouldn't notice it. Okay? Non-disruptive upgrades. That's another thing too. A lot of people don't talk about this in terms of DR. Right? How many people have had an upgrade go south? Right? And you tell people, and it's great because you've got a maintenance window, and you tell people, oh yeah, it'll be done during this maintenance window, and you can't get on the system, or so on and so forth, right? And then all of a sudden, like a week later, something's gone, or not a week, I'm exaggerating, but something's gone wrong, and you can't get up and running, right? Your upgrade should be non-disruptive. And the reason we say that is that we've made it non-disruptive to the point where you can upgrade the BIOS, the firmware, all live. You shouldn't have to shut down your system. Redundancy should be tunable. I talked about RF2, RF3. You can choose which one you want. Transparent, consistent checks. Right? There shouldn't be a process that sits there and slogs down your system running consistency checks on something. Right? It should also be completely transparent. It should be running constantly. Your protection should be, in our case, we talk VM-Centric. Obviously, Zerto's got physical protection as well. Right? But from our side, we talk about VM-Centric because it is a different beast. When you recover a VM, it's a completely different process than recovering a bare metal system. You're not booting, in many cases, you're not booting to a PXE, you're not re-imaging the whole system, you're not loading the OS and so on and so forth, you're just bringing it up somewhere else. It's much quicker. And then multi-site replication, if you need it, very important. Make sure that another thing we offer too that's kind of interesting is we offer something called Acropolis Hypervisor, and you have the ability to replicate from ESXi to Acropolis at your DR site without having to pay for ESXi licenses. So it's just sitting there. The data is migrated across. You don't have to eat the licenses just to just sit there. Okay. Yep.
I have a question regarding the VM. You said like Nutanix is VM-centric protection. So let's say if because Nutanix is a hyperconverged solution, I can rather go for the Docker containers and just deploy over there, which altogether waive off the concept of VM.
Yeah, you can deploy Docker on us, as a matter of fact, too.
So in that case, like how the protection will go on? Will you still look for the
Are you
container?
persistent or non? You're talking about persistent or non-persistent storage?
Non-persistent.
Non-persistent storage, you'll actually have to take the snaps of it at that point, right? But we recommend non-persistent storage is, because I just got into a conversation with this about it, the coworker. Non-persistent storage is not very desirable in a production environment, right? So when you use non-persistent, generally we'd say dev test and that's it. Try and keep it to that, but there should be some sort of persistent storage. If you're deploying on Kubernetes, if you're deploying Docker, if you're Tectonic, whatever the case may be, right?
It would be persistent, it would be the same way you will use the Zerto, right?
Yeah. From our end, yeah, we can set it up with persistent storage.
Container or anything else like that.
Correct.
But in that case, if you have to move, let's say one node goes down,
Hmm?
let's say one of the node goes down, I'm just going to the basics of Nutanix, and instead of VM, I am deploying the Docker containers.
Well, so basically what's happening, yeah, the container will spin up on another node and you'll just have access to the same storage. It'll look exactly the same.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
completely correct.
Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm just like thinking that way that if we move from VMs to Docker containers, which is pretty fast, almost like 5x benefit in terms of deploying your hosting VM, your containers are too fast. So
Well, it makes a lot of sense, right? Why not run only what you need to run the application versus all the extraneous stuff, right? So it makes a ton of sense. Yeah, we actually have a lot of cloud people on staff, and we've actually got a lot of collateral on containers, and I'm actually writing a paper on Tectonic as well, so on Tectonic Kubernetes. So when we talk about VM-centric backup and recovery, it should be non-disruptive. It shouldn't have agents inside the VMs, or it shouldn't. Basically, what we're trying to do is you're trying to consolidate everything in the first place, right? So why add all these little extra things on the outside and take away from that consolidation and open it back up again and make it a pain? That's really the whole thing of VM-centric. You should be snapping at the VM level. You should be using the APIs for the VMs. Okay, the APIs themselves will be able to leverage an application-consistent backup, but that is also something to check as well when you're doing a backup. Make sure that you have, particularly in instances of applications and databases. I'll give you an example, and I won't, this is not a slag, just an architecture. Anybody here using Avamar? Okay. Does Avamar recommend that you back up your exchange with Avamar? Okay, the answer is no. So the reason they don't do it is because the way Avamar is constructed, there'd be too many SIGACs going back and forth across the wire. So what they're generally going to tell you to do is deploy data domain and use DD boost, and have that endpoint function as a media server essentially, right? And then they'll just send the catalogs to Avamar. It'll look like one single UI, but really you've got two solutions under a single UI. Yeah, so that's what they'll do, and then if you want to get it to tape, you'll have Networker in the back end. So, what I mean by that is that you've got VM-centric, but you want to make sure that your application consistent, because a lot of times some of the VM backups can't capture the application itself, or they're not hitting the proper writer. All right. So this is a use case, and these will be the last two slides, and I think I'll be a couple minutes early, and then we'll start giving away Starbucks cards. Everybody needs some coffee anyway, right? So, Lippert Components. Lippert is based in Indiana. They are a manufacturer of parts for RV homes. Okay, and they actually manufacture RVs as well. The area that they're based in Indiana, is like a cottage industry. If you any RV vendor is based out of there. Okay, big company. Their issue was for disaster recovery. They were using SAN to SAN replication. The other part of their issue was that SAN wasn't functioning up to the speed they needed. They were trying to deploy a Microsoft Dynamics application for over 3 years. Microsoft kept coming to them, and they were trying to use their shop floor management, their ERP, everything. And Microsoft was coming up to them and kept telling them, okay, we'll just put SQL on a faster box, right? By the time that they were through with them, SQL was on a quad proc box with just gazillions of, just terabytes of RAM, and it was silly. It was absolutely silly for small 40 gig SQL databases or 30 gig SQL databases. Login times were 10 minutes. They were serving it out through XenApp. Okay, we came in there, and on top of it all, again, they couldn't meet their replication points because you'd have these login times, and everything would just be all over the place. They couldn't actually have any functioning disaster recovery as well. So we came in there. We sold them a Dell-based solution, Dell XC series, which is Nutanix under the hood, and we got their login times down to 10 seconds. It's a simple change of what we did, right? Because of the way we write data, the way the people log in, all that stuff, we got their login times down to 10 seconds. I actually still have the email where he was giddy typing back to me, because before we put it in, he's like, can you help me justify this to my boss? And then afterwards, he's like, ha, because he showed him that, and because that's direct time, that's money. It's very easy. And a DR standpoint, because that's SAN to SAN replication, they couldn't really, the data growth, and you imagine you're in an RV, so you're doing a lot of images and things like that and architectural designs for things, and then you have to, if you're compliant with NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Organization, you have to save things for a certain period of time, right? So these things just become daunting, and more data gets pushed across the wire, right? They wound up going with ZVR. They got the very fast RPOs and RTOs. He actually spoke at the conference last year, if you were here. His name was Rich. Real nice guy. If you ever see him from Lippert, he'll be running around, corner him, get him a beer, he'll tell you the whole story. He's a real nice guy, ex-Marine. We were able to take that stuff and not only fix their login times, but in combined with Zerto, fix their DR, which is something they were not able to do for 3 years. All right? This is a quote from Rich. I don't know if he said this, because quite frankly, it seems too articulate. But when he saw the simplicity of Zerto, and he'd probably punch me, when he saw the simplicity of Zerto, it helped it extend the infrastructure itself. With Nutanix, instead of buying from 3 vendors, we bought from 1. It's much easier to manage, 1 unit versus 3 separate pieces. What we did is take this down to now, so in a DR situation, he essentially just has to go to 2 UIs, and that's it. It's very simple. The idea of Nutanix is, it's very simple, and same thing with Zerto. Don't worry about this stuff. All right, you should set it up, let it do its thing, and you shouldn't have to be logging onto it constantly. There should be no need for you to do even simple things like zoning or setting up ones. I can present storage in 5 seconds, 10 seconds, right? I can add a server when I upgrade, push it in, give it IP addresses, and click OK. It'll auto-detect it. Click OK with the IP addresses, it'll go, and then Zerto will pick up the VMs as well. Should be fully automated. They're fairly automated, right? How many people here like zoning things? You do? You're the guy. Anyway, I'm just kidding. So when we talk about use cases, and wow, went through Fontel here. Anybody, that's pretty gross. Anyway, so for use cases, and you guys get copies of the presentations, for use cases, we're going to recommend things like file level restore, snapshots for short-term recovery, Zerto for, again, short-term RPO, RTO for much larger recovery. SMB customers can use Zerto as well. We're not trying to there's lots of use cases as well. Cloud long-term retention, offsite tape, backup environments. Again, you want to go to Zerto for offsite. My bosses will probably shoot me for saying that actually, but I'm here to tell you the truth. I'm not here to sell you something. I'm not on commission. Continuous availability, Nutanix, again, Metro cluster. Oh, please don't take a picture of this. I'll give you the one with the right slide. I'll give you the one with the right fonts in there. This is it's embarrassing. This is not my machine. So, I'm just kidding. You could take a picture. I was just continuous availability, Nutanix Metro availability. If you need something with 0 RPO and 0 RTO. Now, this is active passive currently, but it will be active fairly soon. But in consideration of those things, sub 5 millisecond latency, 40-kilometer distance. Okay, it's fairly common with clusters for long distances to have that. Most important thing is a sub 5 millisecond latency. Backup and DR for AHV for Acropolis Hypervisor. Anybody here, I think I mentioned Acropolis before, nobody said they knew it. One thing I recommend is going to Nutanix.com and you can download a free version of it. It's a highly customized version of KVM. And it's a complete hypervisor you can download, load it on any system you want. It's called Nutanix Community Edition. Play with it to your heart's content. You'll get that cloud-like experience. And that's it. Okay, so questions, comments, concerns, arm wrestling?
What's the minimum node count?
3, but that's actually going to change in a bit too. That's actually going to go down to 2, I think, and coming out pretty soon. But 3 is a minimum, and we want a quorum to be able to handle fault tolerance.
Yeah. So when you release the update to go to 2, is it something that's a long ways out or pretty close?
No, it's not a long ways out, but what it's really meant for is more so along the lines of remote site. Yeah.
Well, so I'm a CSP and I have customers, thank you, sir. I have customers that you don't have a lot of computing requirements. And with the performance of these new boxes, they want private tenancies, but not a ton of computing or cost. So a 3-node cluster is just like
I get you.
over capacity, you know what I mean?
So there's a couple of different ways we approach that. One, we have an SMB specific box that's a lot less expensive. I think it's like 15-20K. And then the two. It's actually 3 nodes, but it's the CPU is going to be lower. There's only a fixed amount of customization you can do to it. You have small choices, limited choices, and stuff like that.
1U, 2U?
It's 2U.
2U, okay.
Yeah, pretty much everything we do is 2U. We have one 1U server, but everything's going to be 2U.
Okay.
Okay.
So, still has question on tier 1.
Hmm?
So, it still has question on tier 1. Like you just proposed that you can use Zerto with Nutanix for a tier 1 system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say if it's a SQL cluster that you need to protect.
Well,
You know, like
so.
you still can't protect. So there, how you will, or you will put up a different solution.
Well, that's a little bit different in the sense that if you're talking to Microsoft, they're going to recommend always on, right? So they're going to recommend the DAG. So you have the DAG.
Okay, so in that case, it's still Nutanix would be a solution because it's at a specific.
Correct.
You want to use Zerto instead of that it can.
Correct. Yeah, I'm not saying use Zerto for everything, right? Although I'm sure everybody at Zerto would be very happy, but that was the point when I was talking about earlier when I said tier your backup and recovery and design it accordingly. Some apps just don't fit certain profiles.
We are using Nutanix currently.
Oh, nice. How do you like it?
It's good, but yeah, there are a couple of multiple solutions coming up, right? Like from HP, there is Apollo's, there are kind of multiple solutions. So
Yeah, I know. That's.
technology is still in the evolution phase.
Well, I'll tell you what, we actually like that because it does 2 things. A, it validates the market, so we're not just some outlier, right? And then B, it pushes us to be better as well. I think what you find with our stuff is compared to other vendors in the market, I'll give you a quote directly from a place called Citadel Capital in Chicago, a gigantic capital firm. They basically said, you guys are 3 years ahead of everybody. And that's only because we got to jump on the market. The other vendors that came out around the same time, like SimpliVity, for instance, right, which HP bought, they had a different ethos than we did. Right? We were software only. They were hardware-software combination because we didn't want to be stuck and married to a hardware platform.
Pivot 3 also do the
Sorry?
Pivot 3, another competitor to your
Um,
same kind of stuff.
Yeah, they do some of the same kind of stuff. They are a hyperconverged solution, but they target different things. Yeah, they target different things than we do though. I mean, we're more focused up market than they are, right? So yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's hyperconverged solutions coming out, Pivot 3, VxRail, for instance, things like that, right? And again, that's great for us. It helps us kind of, level set and keeps the fire under the hiney, you know what I mean?
So was that Nutanix to Nutanix replication? Was that using Zerto or is that?
It's both, actually. You can do Nutanix to Nutanix with our replication. You can also do it with Zerto. The different.
Zerto does it better than you guys?
Yes, in certain instances, right? I mean, if you're talking metro availability, Zerto doesn't do 0 RPO. I mean, from site to site, right? So that's something you would want to engage us on, on the metro availability side. But if you're talking short-term RPO, RTO, the closest we can get is 1 hour, right? And Zerto is much more efficient to handling space on that stuff as well. And I don't recommend keeping a lot of snaps on their primary tier.
And does Zerto support Nutanix to Nutanix?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just not the AHV.
Just not AHV yet.
When's that?
Me being on the alliances side, I'm constantly on Zerto all the time. You guys got to support us. You guys got to support AHV. It's not too far off. I don't have a specific timeline, but look for something before the end of the year. Shouldn't be too long. There you go.